Good afternoon. My name is Taryn Cunningham. I'm a systems engineer from Veeam. I am located in Sydney, Australia. I know, my accent puts me somewhere on the other side of the planet. I'm originally from Calgary, Canada. I moved out here 10 years ago. Accent still hasn't quite figured out where the heck I am. Now, this afternoon, we're going to be doing the Veeam Availability Suite version 9.5 Architecture and Engineering demo. Now, the Veeam Availability Suite is focused on providing availability for the always-on enterprise, and we do this with 5 key points: high-speed recovery, data loss avoidance, verified recoverability, leverage data, and complete visibility. The Availability Suite is made up of 2 products. It's made up of Veeam One, which provides monitoring, reporting, alerting, and capacity planning for our virtual world, so our VMware environment, our Hyper-V environment, and of course Veeam Backup and Replication, which is the other part of the Availability Suite. It is an agentless tool that allows us to do backups and replicas of our virtual machines from VMware and Hyper-V. Now, this afternoon's session does dive in very deeply into the backup and replication side of the product. We have one very quick demo of Veeam One, and that's about it. So let's get going. Now, this is a little bit messy. I'll level with you guys. You might look at this and say, she took every icon she could find in the icon library and popped them down onto a slide deck, onto a slide. And actually, I went beyond that. I created some of my own because we didn't have the ones that I was looking for at the time. So yes, this is a whole bunch of different icons. It's a whole bunch of the components. Actually, though, what this builds up to is a fairly simple environment. It's how we can use Veeam Backup and Replication today. And what we're going to do is we're going to build up. We're going to put icons onto this slide as we go, and we're going to define everything. We're going to talk about how everything works. This is the most technical of the product demos that we run here in ANZ. Now, the one thing is that that's an awful lot of pieces to think about. And we need to be able to keep track of all those pieces. And the way that we can do that is with Veeam One. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into Veeam One really quick. Now, this is the Veeam One reporter. It is one of the 3 interfaces we have in Veeam One. And we're just going to take a look at a couple of quick reports. Now, the other 2 interfaces that we have in Veeam One are the Monitor client and the Business View client, in case you're curious. Now, let's take a look at our backup assessment. And this is the report I wanted to run here. This is my backup infrastructure assessment. Now, this is a really cool report. This is really handy to know about. And the reason this is handy to know about is it takes a look at how I've deployed Veeam Backup and Replication and compares it with some of Veeam's best practices. Now, this is a demo environment, and I try to make it look a little bit real, or it might just be that it just is a little bit real. So it doesn't quite meet all of Veeam's best practices. I don't have 100% green tick boxes on this particular report, but that's okay because, you know what, in the real world you probably don't. But this does get into which components are deployed, where they're deployed. Do we have everything that we need in order to get the best backups and best replicas? Now, there are dozens of other reports for backup and replication. There are also reports about your VMware environment, your Hyper-V environment, but this is the only one I'm going to show for the moment because it actually compares what we've got versus some of the best practices. Now, I've got a couple of little failed marks here. One of them is that the application-aware image processing for Windows servers isn't working. Now, this is how we get our VMs into a good state, a most recoverable state when we do our backups and replicas. So clearly I need to look into that. And there's also some problems with the VMware tools, probably on some of my Linux VMs. Now, of course, that is a nice little chart view, but it's a lot easier if we can actually see specifically what's going on. So maybe we'll just dive in and we'll take a look at some of the tables and see specifically what's where I can make some improvements in my environment. So this is one of the nice reports that is available in our Veeam One product. And there we go. This is where we're having the trouble on the application we're processing. And sure enough, these are the VMs down here. This is okay. I'm not too worried about this. We're actually not in as rough of shape as I was thinking. Now, that is one of the reports we have. We have all kinds of other reports, compliance overviews, configuration change tracking, orphan VMs. There are two other groups of reports that I do like to mention that are really awesome and really powerful to run before we start to take our backups and our replicas, and those are our infrastructure assessment reports. Now we have infrastructure assessment reports for both VMware and Hyper-V. These can help us get us into the best state we can be in our virtual environment before we start that first backup. Now, I'll level with you guys. One of these reports here on the VMware side is our data store performance assessment. When we do our backups, we are going to grab a whole bunch of data from that data store. We're going to bring it back, do a lot of really cool things to it, and store that in its appropriate location, so either a replica or a backup. But this can be a little hard on the data store when you're pulling all that data. So it's nice to know up front if we need to maybe spend some time to get our data stores into better shape. Okay, those are the few reports I just wanted to bring up from Veeam 1 before we really dive into backup and replication. Now, when we're talking about backup and replication, our first and most important component is the backup server. Now, the backup server is our central orchestration point. It is where we're going to set up our jobs. It's where we're going to do most of our work. Let's dive in. We use this icon to show our backup servers. Now, a couple of things about it. It is on a 64-bit Windows system. It stores some data in a Microsoft SQL database. Now, we do include SQL Express with Veeam Backup and Replication, and this can be used for smaller environments. As the backend to Veeam Backup and Replication, it contains our configuration information. In mid-size and larger environments, you probably want to think about putting it into a real SQL database. If you've already got a SQL database somewhere else, you can have Veeam Backup and Replication use that remote SQL database. If you don't, well, you can install SQL locally on your backup server or put it on another system if you like. Now, the biggest question that people ask when they first start thinking about this is, do I have to have a physical system? No. You can install Veeam Backup and Replication, the backup server component of it, onto either a physical system or a virtual machine. The only time we need to worry about physical is if we're interacting with something that is physical, for example, tapes. If we need that physical interaction with the physical media, hey, we need something physical. But otherwise, we're perfectly happy to sit inside of a virtual machine. Just keep in mind, don't get yourself in a situation where you've got a single point of failure. If you've only got one host and it's hosting your backup server and you lost that host, hey, you could be in a lot of trouble. Now, this backup server is going to perform all of our default roles. Things like the proxy, the repository, the main console, the guest interaction proxy, the mount server, and it's also going to act as our broker service. So we're going to talk a little bit about all of these. Now, the backup server itself is where we add our connections out to our virtual environments, to our Hyper-V hosts or clusters or SCVMM, or into maybe our vCenter environment on the VMware side. Also, you can do vCloud Director or just connect to the hosts directly if you really want. Okay, now of course, as I mentioned before, single points of failure are really, really bad things. We want to make sure that we're avoiding them, so we want to scale out our backup server. Now, in general, the first thing that you could scale out, hey, maybe you've already got that SQL database. Let's just use an existing SQL database. After that, we're probably going to want to move our backup files to some location other than sitting locally on our backup server. So maybe we want to store our backup files on a storage device somewhere else. Now we're going to put our mount server out close to that so that we're able to mount up that data when we want to do a recovery. Now we're going to move some of our processing components close to the location where they need to be. So we're going to move our proxy and our guest interaction proxy over closer to our hosts so that they're able to handle that load because they are our workers that do all the effort in the backups and the replicas. Now we can also deploy a standalone console. The standalone console can be deployed maybe on your laptop. You know what this does? It avoids us having to have those extra terminal services licenses for our backup server if we have multiple people connecting in at a time. It also means that you're able to use that standalone console to connect to multiple backup servers if you want. Oh, that's another point. If you do want to have multiple backup servers, you can deploy as many as you want. You can deploy as many Veeam components as makes sense for your environment. There's no additional license costs to deploy additional components. It's all based on the license of the backup that you install into that backup server itself. Okay, now we did add something new in version 9.5, and this is the broker service. Now in our previous version, we were going out to the vCenter environment anytime you clicked, well, to be honest, anywhere, and we were grabbing the whole tree of data. We're grabbing a whole bunch of different data, and it was causing our interface to be, well, a lot slow. I'll level with you. I saw it most commonly when I was browsing through trying to look up a certain VM inside a backup and replication. It was causing definite slowness. So we added this broker service in 9.5, and what it really does is it caches some of that information about our VMware environment so that we've got that copy locally. We're not having to go out as frequently to our vCenter and pull that data back. It just makes the whole interface a little bit more responsive. So let's take a look at the backup server. Oh, that's interesting. I better connect to my backup server. Oh my. Oh, excuse me for just a second here, guys. My VPN connection did just drop out on me. So I'm just going to have to try again here. There we go. Always happens when you're trying to record the session. Oh well, as far as it goes, this is a pretty minor little demo demon. Okay, so we're going to go into the backup server. And let's just take a look here. Now, this is my Veeam Backup and Replication server right here. It is the central management point. It's where we're going to create all of our jobs, create our backups, our replicas, add our connections out to the environment. Most of this afternoon's demo is going to sit in the backup infrastructure section of this interface. But we also have this tree of virtual machines. We have the storage infrastructure, which is our VMware integrations that we have with certain storage devices that we're going to talk about. We'll talk about the tape. There's the tape infrastructure if you want to write your data off onto tape. And there's some files we can see from the backup server and some history information, just going back in time, seeing what's been happening, what's going on. So this is where we add our connections out to the environment. When you first install, it does take you through a nice little wizard saying, you know, here, you want to connect to vCenter, maybe you should, you know, enter your credentials here. But if you want to add extra pieces to your environment, this is where that wizard is at. This is what that wizard is actually populating. So, for example, let's say that I wanted to take a look at a VMware environment. And this is my vCenter server, so I connect out to it. I provide some credentials that have access to see that environment. There is a whole list of permissions that you need. It tends to be a fairly powerful service account that you use here. The port you're running the vCenter services on, and then that's it. That connects us out to that environment. When you do add your Hyper-V to Veeam Backup and Replication, one thing you might notice is you get a little yellow triangle with an exclamation mark inside of it. Now, VMware is fairly powerful, but on the Hyper-V side, we kind of expect Windows to do an awful lot. We expect those Windows updates to contain everything that we need, and unfortunately with Hyper-V, well, they don't quite contain everything that we need. So what Veeam has done is it said, hey, you know what, I'll enumerate all the fixes that are on your hosts. If you're missing some of the fixes that Veeam suggests are best practice, we're going to put that little yellow triangle on there, and it's going to help us to identify if you've got those hot fixes and help you actually get slightly better results on the Hyper-V environment. So just a heads up, you do sometimes see that as a little yellow triangle. I do like to mention that. Now I do want to go up here to this little menu and just talk about a couple of things. On the very top here there is an upgrade option. This is for applying the latest update. Now I'm currently up to date, and if I take a look here I can actually show you the about. I'm running version 9.5 update 1, which is our current version available, and you can see here it's 9.5.0.823. So that's my license is up to date, but if there was a new upgrade available, I could actually automatically update from this location. Managed credentials are the credentials that are coming out of my backup server. So things like the account that I'm using to talk to vCenter, or the account that I'm using to talk into the Microsoft environment. You know what? It's nice to have a central point to manage those passwords, so we gave you the credential manager. Now, managed passwords are the encryption keys. So if we are encrypting our data at rest in the backup files, we can actually manage our passwords for those encryption keys here. If we want to connect up to Microsoft Azure in order to do things like the direct restore to Azure, this is where we can add our Azure account. Users and roles are the users who are able to log into this console and do some of the tasks within it. So this is where you can set them up. Network traffic rules are our global traffic rules. Now these, a couple of things about this. First off, there's the number of streams that we use. If we want to use a preferred network, so maybe there's one network we want the data to flow over instead of another, we can do that. And we can add some rules. Now these rules apply to our Veeam components. So any Veeam component whose IP address is in the source range that's communicating with a Veeam component whose IP address is in the target range has to follow the rules. Now those rules could be to encrypt the network traffic. Obviously that's going to encrypt our data as it's in flight between those two components. Or we can choose to throttle the traffic. Now encryption's, it's a binary operation. It's either on or off. But throttling, maybe there's certain times of day when we want that throttling to be enacted, and maybe there's times of day when we want it to just go free. So we can actually choose different rules for different times of day on the throttling side. So those are the traffic rules. And configuration backup. Now, configuration backup is a nice thing to know about. I said that we keep our configuration data in a Microsoft SQL database. Now, that Microsoft SQL database is really important to protect. So what it contains is the information we need in order to turn any Veeam backup server into our Veeam backup server. Basically, it would reconfigure that for us. So we create these little backup files, and they're .bco files, and they sit in our backup repository. And what they let us do is to actually take the data from that SQL database, put them into a backup file, and have them available to us in the event that we lost our backup server. Now, if you choose to encrypt your configuration backup down here, that data is going to be encrypted, kind of obvious, otherwise it wouldn't be called encrypt. But the more important thing is we're actually going to keep our passwords inside of that backup file so we don't have to re-enter them again. Just a nice to know feature. Console, we can use the PowerShell scripting or PuTTY. Color themes, if you're not a fan of the Veeam green, you could choose a sea green like I've got, or marine blue or ocean graphite. License shows you your license information. And you probably thought, hey, she skipped over the general options. Well, I did, just so that I could come back to them in a minute. Now, some of the options in here are Enterprise Plus features. I just want to give you that little teeny heads up that, hey, you know what? Some of them may not show up the way they show up for me, for you, if you're not running the Enterprise Plus edition. Now, enabling parallel processing. Hey, it's great to be able to do two things at once. This is what allows us to do that. And storage latency control. If we have some data stores where we maybe want to slow things down a little bit, we would rather have slower backups than to have impact on the running VMs, hey, we can actually start to set up some latency controls. Email settings, hey, do we want to send out notifications? We can send out email notifications. SNMP, if we want to send SNMP communication out to some other tool. Notifications, hey, do we want to give some notifications if we're running out of disk space, or maybe if we're about to have we found a new update. Hey, it's great to know that kind of thing. And the last one is history. How much history are we keeping in that database? Okay, so those are our general options. Those are the main pieces that we have there. Now I'll go back to my main view and you can see all my jobs. One thing to keep in mind is that with the exception of tape, we're always going to split our backups for VMware and our backups for Hyper-V into separate jobs. So we don't mix except in tape. It's always going to be VMware or Hyper-V, but you can have jobs for both in the same interface. You can see here that I have my Hyper-V backup jobs and I have my VMware backup jobs. So backups, replicas, it's always going to be from one hypervisor to the same type of hypervisor. We're not too worried about the exact versioning of it, but we can't switch between them, mostly. Okay, cool stuff. Let's talk a little bit about, well, let's actually put some of this onto our slide. First off, we're going to put our virtual environment down there. We've got two sites, one with hosts at each side and a VPN between them. We'll put our backup server out at the DR location, and maybe we'll put a standalone console out at the production side. Now, let's talk about our main worker. This is our Veeam proxy server. And we'll also talk a little bit about the guest interaction proxy. Now, the proxy is our muscles. The proxy is what's responsible for communicating with our host and data store and pulling all that data. So it needs the power. Now, on the VMware side, we have three transport modes for the proxy. There's the direct storage mode, which are actually two. We have direct SAN, which means we've got a fiber channel or an iSCSI connection from the proxy to the SAN where the VMDK files are sitting. Or if our VMDK files are sitting on NFS, we can go directly over NFS. Now our second mode is the virtual appliance mode. This uses VMware's hot add to pull the data right up through the host. And our last mode is the network mode where we're going over the network. Now you'll notice one thing about these is that they're not pushing data through the backup server. The backup server is just our main coordination point, which is the way that the product is designed. We're not going to pull all the data through that backup server. It's an important piece, but it's not that important. On the Hyper-V side, we have two types of proxies. There's one that sits on the host. The thing about that is that it uses the CPU and the network on that host, and that can be a bit expensive. You may want to look at doing an off-host proxy instead. That off-host proxy is going to use the data that is sitting on the SAN, or the cluster shared volume, or local storage, or the SMB3, Windows SMB3 share. We're going to use the hardware VSS with the transportable shadow copies. It's probably going to be a physical system, and it should be part of the same cluster. It does need to have the same Hyper-V role as that host. Just some of the rules. If you are looking at deploying an off-host proxy, I do strongly encourage you to take a look in the user guide while you're speccing everything out, because it makes life a little bit easier than trying to remember all of this paragraph of information. Now, the proxies are critical in our replication jobs. What we need in a replication job is to have a proxy close to the source of the data to grab those blocks of data that we need. And we also need a proxy over close to our destination to take that data from the source proxy and inject it into the replica restore points, which are powered off but ready to go copies of our VMs. What's the difference between a backup and a replica? It's how the data is sitting at rest. When we're talking about a backup, it's going into a Veeam backup file where we're going to have to use Veeam in order to do a recovery. When we're talking about replication, we're talking about having a powered off copy of the virtual machine. We recommend using Veeam to do your failovers or failbacks. However, worst case scenario, it's a fully registered VM. You can actually use the native tools to power it on directly. Now, I've also put the guest interaction proxy on this slide. The guest interaction proxy is responsible for communicating into the virtual machines, giving it that little warning that, hey, we're about to run a job. Let's use the Microsoft VSS to get the applications into the best state we can, or let's talk into Oracle and say, hey, Oracle, we're about to take a snapshot. We're about to do a replica. Let's make sure that we're in the most recoverable state we can be in. So let's pop that replication job onto the slide. Just an FYI, I haven't shown a little repository. We do store a little bit of information about the replicas inside of the backup repository. And that is where we're going to go right after we demo the proxy. Now, the proxies are pretty quick to demonstrate. You do want to have more than one in your environment. The reason for that, well, hey, if one's not available, then you've got a second. It's always a good thing to have that second. As I said, this is our main data mover. It is a very important component in our environment. I'll do a quick look at a VMware proxy. And this is actually the proxy that's sitting on my backup server. And did I miss? Oh, actually, sorry, that's how you add an extra server. So I added a managed server there. So that's that managed server. Now the proxies are up here at the top for VMware and for our off-host proxies. So I'm going to take a look at this. Now you can see here, this is a VMware proxy, the transport mode. I do have the automatic selection, which is going to choose the best connection to that data, so direct storage access, virtual appliance, or network. You can also choose to fail over to network mode if the primary mode fails or is unavailable. Now there is an option down here, enable host to proxy traffic encryption in network mode. I suggest that you use this with a lot of caution. In fact, I would really recommend that if security is that much of an issue for you, that you use the direct storage access or the virtual appliance mode and do not allow it to fail over to network mode, because this adds a lot of extra effort on the hosts just to encrypt the data between the host and the proxy. It's not really going to give you that great a result. So you know what? I'd suggest using one of the other modes, but it is there if you want it. Connected data stores, you can choose which data stores are connected to this proxy, and you can choose the maximum number of concurrent tasks. Now the maximum number of concurrent tasks is equal to the number of vCPUs inside of this virtual machine, or the number of physical cores on a physical system. This is the number of VMDK files we're able to pull data from at a time. Now this particular system is also fulfilling a lot of other roles, so I've limited it down to 2, but it's up to you on what you want to do. The traffic rules is a link into those global traffic rules we took a look at before. So that's the creation of a VMware proxy. On the Hyper-V side, we do have the 2 types, the on-host and the off-host. I currently only have on-host proxies, so those actually sit on these Hyper-V hosts themselves. There's no separate proxy for on-host. But when you get down to the apply section, it gives you the same options on the number of concurrent tasks. So in my case, I'm just doing 2 concurrent tasks. That is so that I'm not overloading my hosts a little bit. And that means that I'm actually pulling from 2 VHDX files or VHD files at a time. Okay, so that's my proxies. As I said, they are the workers in our environment. Let's pop those onto the slide and pop the replication job in there too. And let's talk about the repository, where we're going to store some of those backup files and, well, some other bits and pieces too. Now, we do have our regular backup job. This can also use the guest interaction proxy. Now, this is a backup repository down here. It is a storage location. There are 4 types of repositories: Windows, Linux, shared folder, or deduplicating storage appliance. The deduplicating storage appliance is the special integrations we have with the EMC data domain, the Exagrid, and the HPE store once devices. By the way, data domain, use Boost, and EMC or HPE store once, use Catalyst if it's at all possible. Now, that repository can also be used to store data from our agents or our endpoint. So we can actually use that as a storage location there. Now, if we're doing it locally within the site, it's an on-site backup. If we're doing it to a remote repository, it's an off-site backup. I prefer to try to avoid the off-site backup as much as I can because, well, by adding that longer connection out to that secondary location, we're making our backup window grow. And growing backup windows are a little bit, well, not favorably viewed. So you know what? That's okay. We're just going to send that. If we do it locally, we can send a copy using a backup copy job between the 2 repositories. But if it's what you got, it's what you got. Oops. Okay, so that's the backup job. Now, let's talk a little bit about what's actually inside of those backup files. Now, this is, I call it the Rubik's Cube slide. And the reason I call it that is because, well, it looks like a Rubik's Cube. This is the way I kind of visualize our Veeam data without per VM backup files. So we've got one big full backup and some big increments, and they're just a mix-up of all the different blocks from all the different VMs. Now, when we use a per VM backup files, it's going to take up more space because we lose the ability to deduplicate between the VMs. But what we get is one chain of smaller files per virtual machine. Now, this is great for our scale-out backup repositories. Now, a scale-out backup repository is, well, I'll call it a software-defined repository because what we're doing is we're putting together multiple repository locations, and we'll call them extents because now they're going to be a little bit different than just a regular repository. And we're going to put a software layer on top of it and let the software determine where our files are going to sit at rest. So we have 2 options for choosing the type of the location where those files are going to sit. We can either do data locality, which means we're going to keep our chain of backup files together, or we can do performance, which means we're going to split our full backups from our increments. Now, one thing about our full backups, they contain a single point in time and the ability to get the VM back out of that backup file and into a running state. The increments are the changes from the previous run of the job to the time that job was run. So they actually only contain little deltas. They don't contain anything by themselves that lets them do a recovery. They rely on the existence of having that full backup file. So we need to protect those full backup files. Now, proxy affinity is something that we added in version 9.5. And this is actually a situation that I encountered in November. What the customer had was one big, strong proxy sitting in production that was being used to do the local backups. And that proxy could handle about, I don't know, it was about 12 VMs at a time, 12 VM files. But their jobs had up to 20 or 30 different VMs in them. And so Veeam Backup and Replication said, hey, we should be doing as much as we can, it found this other proxy at the remote location, which was actually meant to be used as the destination proxy for our replication jobs. It wasn't meant to be used for the backups. And what was happening is that the data was bouncing from our production environment over to the DR environment and then back again. Now, I did suggest some changes that could have helped this customer out because this was back in version 9. But in 9.5, we've added the proxy affinity that lets us chain the repository to the proxies that are local so that we're not pulling the data all the way over to the other environment and then all the way back again. Now, let's talk a little bit about the creation of those backup files. Now, we've got our VM here. And by the way, this could be multiple VMs. It's just a lot easier for me to draw one. And we're going to identify the blocks of data that contain things that are useful. We're going to skip over anything that's empty and or just doesn't contain anything that we need. Now, an active full is going to happen on the first run of any job. So what we're going to do, we're going to go out to the environment, we're going to grab everything. We're going to use the proxy to do this. It's going to take all those blocks and it's going to create a VBK file on the repository, a Veeam full backup. The next run of the job, well, we're just going to look at what changed in the VM. We're going to use VMware's change block tracking. Or if we've got Hyper-V 2016, we're going to use the resilience change tracking. If we've got Hyper-V other than 2016, so 2008 R2 SP1 through 2012 R2, we're going to use we're going to use Veeam's own change block tracking in order to identify the changes. So we do have change block tracking. We have to use Veeam's if we don't have Hyper-V 2016 though. So we're going to grab just the blocks that changed. We're not even going to look at any blocks that haven't been identified as being changed. And we're going to just pop them onto the file system as an increment. Now we're going to keep running this over and over again as each time we run our job. And after a while, we're going to want to create a new full backup in order to start a new chain because, as I said before, those increments don't contain what we need in order to do recovery. They need to be put together with the full backup in order to do that. So we're going to want to start a new chain, and that is a synthetic full. Now, synthetic full takes what we have, what changed in the environment, puts it together with what we've already got on the file system, and builds a new full backup. So basically makes a copy of a whole bunch of different blocks of data. Now this is really good because we're starting a new chain. Eventually we're going to be able to delete the old chain. And we've got that nice and fresh, but we didn't have to pull everything from the running VM. On the other hand, though, it's taking up a fair amount of space in my repository. Well, in 9.5, we're integrating into the Advanced Resilient File System, REFS, in Windows Server 2016 and taking advantage of some of that REFS capability. So we're still going to identify that piece of data that changed. But what we're going to do after that is we're going to do a spaceless synthetic full. We're going to identify the location of those existing blocks instead of copying them. So what we're just going to do, kind of create a whole bunch of little arrows pointing at the blocks that we need. And we're going to be able to create that full backup without actually having to take up that full backup's worth of space. Okay, now that we just saw is a forward incremental with a synthetic full. It's actually the second of the modes that are sitting on this slide right here. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the other modes that are available because that's just one of the four. Well, it's one of the three. The third one in the middle is a little bit of a special case. Now, first run of any Veeam backup job, we're going to grab everything and create our full backup. We're going to run an active full. The second run, if we're doing a forward style of backup, we're just going to take those blocks of data and pop them onto the file system. The one on the bottom is our reverse incremental. And the reverse incremental goes out, grabs those changes, puts the changes into the full backup, and pulls out the difference, pulls out the rollback. So it creates a reverse incremental file, a .vrb. Now, think about it a little bit. If I wanted to do a recovery from Tuesday For my reverse incremental, I would only need to use that full backup, that VBK file. But for the other ones that we have on the slide here, we're going to have to put together the increment with the full to build it. Now, it's not a big deal when you're talking about 2 restore points like we're showing on screen right now. But as it continues to grow, and let's say we've got a chain that's 99 restore points long, most of our recoveries are going to come from our more recent points in time, which means that because it's coming from that recent point in time, it's better to have that reverse incremental. It's going to be easier on the restores. Just a little heads up on it. Now, notice that, oops, I'm just going to go back just a little bit here and replay this. Now, you can see here that we've hit Saturday, so we're running that synthetic full. And we've got the 2 options on the forward incremental. One is a synthetic full, and one is a synthetic full with a transform. Now that transform activity is pretty cool. What it's going to do is it's going to take that old chain of backup files, so the full and the increments, and it's going to twist and turn it upside down and turn it into rollbacks. It is a lot of work on the storage, on the repository where those VMs are sitting, those backup files are sitting, but you know what? It does save some space. Now we're going to keep playing this forward just a little bit. And you'll notice the one on the top, the one I haven't talked about yet, that's the forever forward incremental. Now what this does is it doesn't create those new full backups on the regular basis. What it does is once it's got enough restore points, it's just going to take that oldest increment and inject it into the full and update our full. So it's going to create a chain of restore points that keeps moving for us, keeps moving forward. Now that forward incremental, the second one, it does take up more space because we can't delete anything until we can delete the whole chain. Now, we were talking earlier about replication, and we can do replication from our backup files. So let's say that we're doing a backup into a backup repository and then building the replica restore points based off of that. Hey, it's a great way to do it. This means that our backups and our replicas are from exactly the same point in time, and also they are not having to take multiple snapshots or checkpoints on the production VMs. So it's a bit of an advantage. But the recovery point objective that we're going to get when we have multiple jobs in order to get to that one destination is going to be increased because we're going to have to, the RPO is going to be the time it takes to finish the backup and finish the replica. Just a heads up, it is something to think about. It is an option that's available to you. Now, of course, we're able to do all kinds of recoveries using Veeam Backup and Replication. We can recover virtual machines, we can recover application items, guest files, all kinds of bits and pieces. We're going to take that data out of the repository or out of the replicas and get it up and going to where it needs to be. Now, let's take a very quick look at a repository and a scale-out repository. So this is a backup repository here, and I'm going to take a look at my Quantum DXI. Now, this is a shared folder repository. It's actually deduplicating storage. We don't have a special integration with Quantum, but we don't really need it. So you can see here it's a shared folder. It is a share sitting on there, and there is something called a gateway server. Now the gateway server is important to know about because we're doing processing. We're changing around some of the files that are sitting on the storage device. Because we're changing around some of the files on that storage device, hey, you know what? We need to have some processing close to it. So the gateway helps us to have that local processing component sitting close to the shared folder. Now, if you're talking a Windows or a Linux repository, we don't need it because, hey, we are actually able to install that locally on that system. It's a shared folder where we run into trouble. Now, the repository itself, that's the location we're storing our files. Load control if we want to limit the number of concurrent tasks or the read-write data rate as the data is flowing into that storage device. There are advanced settings. Align the backup file data blocks. This can help with deduplicating storage. It's also chosen automatically when you use REFS as your destination, just an FYI. Decompressing the backup data blocks before storing is something that we do for our deduplicating storage because, well, our compression is good. However, we're going to have, if we decompress it and store it a little bit more raw, that deduplicating storage is going to be able to really shrink that data down for us a lot easier. So we actually get better results if we decompress before we write. Now there is an option for backed by rotating hard drives. This is not available for CIFS repositories. However, if you want, you are able to use rotating hard drives to offset your data and force the use of per VM backup files. Now the mount server is used during recoveries to mount up the data. We can also enable our vPower NFS, which is used to do our VMware recoveries for the instant VM recovery and sure backup. And that is the creation of the repositories. And then you can create a scale-out repositories, which are simply a regular repository, 2 regular repositories or more. You can have as many extents as make sense in the Enterprise Plus edition. You're limited to 3 in the Enterprise edition, by the way. So you choose your extents, and there are some advanced settings here to force the use of per VM backup files or do a full backup if the required extent is offline. And then policy is either going to be data locality or performance. If you do performance, you're able to choose specifically what files are allowed to be stored on which extent. And then when you create your jobs, you just point it to that scale-out repository, and Veeam is going to take care of choosing where those files are going to sit at rest. In case you're really curious, I'll show you a Windows repository, what it actually looks like on the file system, what a backup extent looks like maybe. You can see here, I am using per VM backup files. There's my VM name, BBK file, VIB file. This is an incremental backup. In fact, I believe it's an incremental backup with a synthetic full. I just grabbed one at random. I didn't specifically look for this one. Now, let's continue onward. Oh, we got a lot to go. We've only got 10 minutes. Okay, so let's put the repositories and those jobs on here. And let's talk a little bit about what's happening behind the scenes. Now, first off, we're going to start and talk about VMware backup and replication. When we're actually doing the backup, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to warn, freeze, quiesce our virtual machines. We're going to use the application-aware processing, potentially the VMware tools with some scripts. Now, it's coming from the backup server. This could also be the guest interaction proxy. We're then going to take our VMware snapshot. Now, this is going to freeze our VMDK files, and we're going to start collecting our changes in a redo log, or in the snapshot itself, if you want to call it that. We're going to collect the blocks of data that we need from that frozen VMDK file. We're going to skip anything that's empty. The first run, we're going to grab everything. Next runs, we're going to use change block tracking to only even look at what changed since the previous job. We're going to remove the duplicate blocks of data. We're going to compress it, and we're going to send it to its next location, either repository or proxy. At the very end, we're going to do our snapshot consolidation. Now, this is going to take those redo logs and put them into the VMDK file. Now, this is where we can run into that little nasty thing called snapshot stun. Now, snapshot stun is what happens when we're doing that snapshot consolidation, and that is taking a lot of work, and the users actually get affected by it. It's a bad thing. Now, if you have certain types of storage, we can use those storage devices to do backup and replication from storage snapshots. Changes our process around just a little bit. We're still going to warn, freeze, quiesce the VM. Once that's done, we're still going to take our VMware snapshot. And, and PowerPoint has decided to restart on me. Wow, today is just, I am having a few glitches today. Okay, let's go back to that slide there. Okay, so we're still going to warn, freeze, quiesce the VM. We're still going to take our VMware snapshot. Once that's done, we're going to call the storage device. We're going to say, hey, storage device, can you please take a storage snapshot? Now, this is available on Nimble, Dell EMC, VNXC, and Unity, NetApp FAS series, and HPE StoreServe and Store Virtual. Now we're going to call that device. We're going to say, hey, device, take a storage snap for us. Once that's done, we're going to do our VMware snapshot consolidation. After that, we're going to collect those blocks of data from the storage snapshot. We're going to compress it, send it to its next location, and then clean up after ourselves and remove that storage snapshot. So this means we moved this VMware snapshot consolidation up to the front of the process, up to step number 4 here, which means it only took a couple of minutes. We have less impact on the running VMs, less chance of snapshot stun. Hyper-V side, we've got online backup and replication. So we're going to warn, freeze, quiesce the VM. We're going to use the Hyper-V integration components and Microsoft BSS when we do this, by the way. We're going to take an internal VM snapshot. We're going to take a host external snapshot or a volume snapshot of the location where those VHD files are sitting. We're going to do an auto recovery, which is going to remove our internal snapshot. We're going to collect the blocks of data from that volume snap. We're going to compress it, send it to its next location, and then we're going to clean up after ourselves. We can also do an offline one, put the VM in a save state, get the host external snap, return the VM to its regular state, collect the data, compress it, send it to its next location, and clean up. Now this does involve a little bit of downtime because we did have to bring the VM into that saved state. Now, crash consistent backup isn't ideal, but it's better than nothing. So we do have the ability to do Hyper-V crash consistent backups. That means we're not going to talk to the VM at all. We're just going to take that host external snapshot, collect the data, compress it, send it to its next location, and clean up after ourselves. Now, we did add a few integrations with Server 2016. The Advanced Resilience File System integration and VAS clone was the one that I showed specifically. But we can also use our EFS to help ensure our backup archive integrity, make sure that it's in good shape. We integrate with PowerShell Direct capabilities during the application-aware processing. We support Hyper-V 2016. We use the resilient change tracking. We do support Hyper-V hosts installed on Nano Server. You do have to use an on-host proxy for that, just a heads up. We also support the 2016 Microsoft Enterprise applications, Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, and SQL. And we added one little bonus feature, it's right at the bottom there, and that is instant recovery from any backup. So if you've got a backup sitting in a backup repository, we can do an instant recovery of that backup file, whether it's VMware, Hyper-V, or agent-based, to Hyper-V 2016. It's kind of a cool thing. It's one of the few places where we can cross the hypervisor. A few helpers I want to introduce you to. Tape is one of them. We are going to talk to our tape server that is physically connected to the library or drives where our media, the tapes themselves, exist. We're always going to go from disk to tape. We're never going to back up directly to tape. We're always going to back up into a disk location first and then copy that data off onto tape. Another helper is the backup copy job. The backup copy job allows us to take the data from one chain of backup files or multiple chains of backup files in a primary repository and build new backup files in a secondary Veeam Backup repository. We also have WAN acceleration capabilities. It is a software-based WAN accelerator. We put one on a Windows server on each side of the connection, and it helps us reduce the amount of bandwidth that we're using. So we kind of make a trade. We trade processing and identifying that smallest piece of data that we have to send across the connection so that we're able to just send that tiny amount of data instead of the whole big block. So it is based on global deduplication. The more power, the faster disk you give those WAN accelerators, the better advantage you see from it. We have the Enterprise Manager. Now the Enterprise Manager is a web portal that allows us to log in. We're able to view and manage multiple backup servers from the Enterprise Manager. We're also able to do recovery activities from the Enterprise Manager. And we have the virtual lab. Now the virtual lab allows us to create an isolated environment, and within that isolated environment we can turn on some of our VMs. In this case I'm showing my VMware replicas being powered on, and we're able to power on those VMs. We're able to check to make sure that they're in good shape. Now we're able to do sure backup, which means we're taking the data from our backup files, powering on those VMs inside of that virtual lab, checking to make sure that our backup files are recoverable. Now we can do the same from our VMware replicas or our VMware storage snapshots. So it's just a nice to have feature. You're able to create that isolated environment, power up those VMs inside of it, check to make sure that things are good. You can even use that as an on-demand sandbox and do testing, experimentation, troubleshooting, using that virtual lab to keep the VMs isolated from our production copies without having to actually maintain a separate environment. Now we're going to take a very, very quick look at WAN accelerators and virtual labs. Now virtual labs, I just want to show you what it looks like when it's actually running, because it's actually more interesting to see that. So I'm going to go into my VMs and templates. Now this is the VMware vSphere web client. Now you can see here I've got this little folder with the VLab inside. And you can see that there's 2 VMs currently powered on and this little proxy appliance. The proxy appliance is part of the virtual lab. It creates some of that isolation for us. It's actually deployed in this option. The application groups is how we choose which VMs are starting in there. The piece that puts those two together is the Sure Backup job itself that actually sits as a job in the Backup and Replication tab. Now the other thing I want to show you very quickly is the WAN accelerators. Now I just have a single WAN accelerator right now. In the Enterprise Edition I'm able to define source-side WAN accelerators. And my Cloud Connect service provider can provide that target side. So you can choose the port that the traffic is flowing on, the number of streams. There is a global cache that creates a cache of common blocks at the target side. So this is a source-side WAN accelerator. It doesn't actually need the cache. And then it's review, apply, summary. So normally you see WAN accelerators, you see them in pairs. There's one close to the source and one close to the target. In my case, my service provider is providing the target side of my WAN accelerator. Okay, since we've already gone over time, let's hop back over here, pop those components onto the progress slide, and talk just a tiny bit about cloud. No second site? Hey, let's move our backup server out to the production environment, clean up all of our second site stuff, and let's talk about some of our options. One of the options is public cloud. Maybe we've got some VMs that are sitting up in the public cloud. We want to send some of our backup copies up to that location. Hey, we can actually send that up. I do recommend having something where you're able to install some processing power up there. A Windows VM, something like that can be very handy to have. You are able to do recoveries from it. You can also do a direct restore to Microsoft Azure. This allows us to actually take our VMs that are sitting in a backup repository and create VMs up in Azure using that data. Cloud Connect allows us to work together with a service provider partner. They have their own special Veeam Backup server that has a Cloud Connect license. It allows them to have cloud hosts, cloud repositories. They have their regular components such as proxies and WAN accelerators, and a cloud gateway. And what the cloud gateway allows us to do is to send our data up to that service provider without having to have a VPN. Now we've also got a cloud portal which allows us to use our replicated VMs at that service provider location, and some network extension appliances that can help us to handle the network in a failover or failback state. So these VMs over here are our VMs. They're sitting at that service provider. They're powered off and ready to go, just like it would be if we had our own DR site. Now, we choose and we create the jobs. We're able to store backup files up with that service provider. We're also able to store copies of our virtual machines up at that service provider and use them as our DR site. So they're providing DR as a service. Now, that actually has brought us to our goal. We've defined every icon on this slide. If you have any questions, pop them into the GoToWebinar box. We do run a full series of product demos. They are all available on veeam.com/product demo. Thank you very much. Have a perfectly wonderful day.